So welcome back to another week and another meeting of 151C. Today we looked at the politics of the long 18th century from 1714 through to the Peterloo Massacre of 1819. Today we're going to look at the big social and cultural and intellectual changes of that period of time, and on Thursday we will look at the economic transformations that occurred at that used to be known as the Industrial Revolution. So the critique of the new imperial British state that emerged after the Revolution of 1688 and the new political movements committed to reform it that I discussed did not come out of nowhere. Indeed, they were made possible by the emergence of new enlightened ideas from John Locke to Mary Wollstonecraft to reimagine and theorize anew the relationship between the state and its subjects. Of course, the state placed real limits on what could be said and what could be done. But nonetheless, there were dramatic expansion of both the content and the form of public debate in the 18th century, and it's that which is the primary focus of this lecture. This was an amazing development, considering that the civil wars and revolution that had occurred during the 17th century had meant that the central question that historians have got to ask is, how did society become civil enough that the sectarians and political debates of that period of time, those conflicts that had torn apart that society, became relatively normal or normalized, and not just tolerated by the state, but, as we saw with the growth of loyalism, actually used by it. Now, usually this concept of civil society as this realm of public debate is conceived as happening outside of the state, in voluntary organizations. But I'm going to suggest to you today that the shape and parameters of civil society in Britain can't be quite so easily separated from the state or from, more broadly, the forms of government that began to develop during that period of time. Nonetheless, measured in terms of the proliferation of public debate and the appeals to a public as the legitimate basis of support for any position, as well as the numbers and types of voluntary organizations and associations, Britain's civil society was arguably the first to emerge from the ancient regimes of Europe's old world. But that happened not as a consequence of some innate British genius. Enlightened ideas were, first of all, a transnational formation. They took shape in Britain around also its imperial expansion and encounter with the New World. Moreover, the Enlightenment shouldn't be seen simply, the emergence of this new type of enlightened civil society of public debate shouldn't be simply seen as the emergence of a new type of intellectual emancipation. The social theorist Michel Foucault famously described this process as creating not just new liberties, but also new types of disciplines, of new rules of how it is that people were supposed to be free. And finally, I'm going to suggest to you that at the end of the 18th century, Britain's ancient regime was not simply challenged by this new development, but had become more secure than any other in Europe. And in fact, that the forms of customary thought and organisation that structured social life continue to have a strong hold for many people. So again, this is a story of important new developments, but new developments that simply didn't simply displace the old world, but that grew out of it and around it. So let me begin this lecture by talking about the social order of the 18th century. British society in the 18th century was highly hierarchical and deeply structured around a series of very finely graded forms of social distinction, of different ranks and orders, different stations and degrees, of different sorts of people, and different classes. These are all terms used to describe the various distinctions that made up the social hierarchy. Indeed, when the tax official and statistician Gregory King investigated the state and condition of England in 1688, he detailed no less than 20 different types of social groups and described them as being differentiated by, quote, various ranks, degrees, titles, and qualifications. That is to say, we have here not simply an early type of sociology, of distinctions of social type, but a jumble of different types of forms of distinction, by political office, by economic occupation, and by social location. And these were still very much in place when Joseph Massey undertook a very similar exercise in 1759 and 1760. And you have a handout before you, which is the compares and contrasts the two different studies by King and Massey, which I'll return to in a moment. What I'm suggesting to you is that in many ways, Britain's social order was closer to a caste society than a class society. It was conceived as a natural order, even as a divinely ordained chain of being, a perfectly calibrated system of mutually supporting divisions of rights and duties that structured all sections of society. And these distinctions were determined largely by birth. Whatever role one was born into was the role that one was expected to obediently perform for the rest of one's life. The Tory man of letters, Samuel Johnson, remarked that the British were naturally schooled in subordination to these hierarchies by, quote, the fixed, invariable external rules of distinction or of rank, which create no jealousy since they are held to be accidental by birth. But whether these were products of the accidents of birth or of a divine order, either way they were legitimated, these types of social distinctions and hierarchies, they legitimated a grossly unequal division of wealth and power. And that social order reproduced itself. The aristocracy and gentry strictly regulated their rights of inheritance through laws of primogeniture and entail, which ensured that their estates were left entirely to the eldest son, and that he was legally bound to do the same for his eldest son. Other sons were given lump sums or annuities or posts in the military, the church, or the court, or as a government official, and this, of course, became the basis of the radical critique of the old corruption of the aristocracy. Similarly, the area of politics became also an increasingly dynastic affair. In 1754, over half of MPs had followed in the footsteps of their fathers, and over two-thirds had some broader family connection to the House of Commons. The professional classes also tended to reproduce themselves by birth. A third of the clergy of the Anglican Church had followed their fathers, and the emerging legal and medical professions also tended to reproduce themselves through family lines. Marriage was often a key way for the maintaining of social status and forms of social distinction. Women with dowries the use of dowries for daughters was designed to find them a husband who could secure their position in life, or even improve that of the family as a whole. The trade in daughters on the marriage market reflected the utterly subordinate position of women. The reproduction of the aristocracy, of the political classes, and of the professions occurred through men. Women had no legal rights, but marriage ensured that they became the exclusive property of their husbands, and they lost all rights to their own property or of custody of their children. The strictly hierarchical nature of family life, in a sense, reflected the deeper structure, hierarchy of the social order itself, with men ruling as patriarchs over women and children, whose duty it was to obey. Mary Astell, one of the early British feminists, wrote in her Reflections on Marriage in 1700, "If men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves?" Now, I want to emphasize that although I'm suggesting that this social order reproduced itself in an almost caste-like way, there weren't legal barriers to social mobility, and here the caste analogy breaks down. It was possible, social mobility was possible. It was just exceptional. And there were famous cases of people proceeding from poor backgrounds to become rich and esteemed. So Captain Cook, the naval hero, Captain Cook and Admiral Nelson, the poet William Wordsworth, the landscape architect Capability Brown, all of these people came from humble origins to great social and prestige. But I would suggest they were the exceptions that proved the rule. Now, I want to now detail the precise layout of this social structure through your handout, which that you see behind me. So the population of England and Wales in the first half of the 18th century was between 6 and 6.5 million people, and if you add Scotland, you would get an extra 1.5 million, remembering that Ireland is not formally part of Britain until the Act of Union in 1801. Out of this population was structured through this plethora of different ranks and degrees and stations, which I'm going to try and detail for you now. At the top of this social hierarchy were the aristocracy, those with hereditary titles as dukes or earls or marquises or viscounts or barons and lairds. There were very few in number of this high aristocratic class. Around 100 aristocratic families had such hereditary titles. They possessed vast landed estates. Indeed, they owned almost a quarter of all the land in Britain, and that excluded their often extensive colonial holdings as well. Their income came from rents from these landed estates, and the surplus capital that they had from these rents was invested often in financial incomes, in financial markets. This created often very considerable incomes for these families, up to a peak of something like £30,000 a year. And their influence and their sons were everywhere, in the royal court, in the leading positions of the military, in the foreign service, in the House of Commons, as well as, of course, in the House of Lords. By the end of the 18th century, there was arguably no other aristocracy as rich or as powerful or as entrenched as the British aristocracy. Just below them were the gentry classes. This was a capacious group of about 20,000 significant landowners, some with titles as peers or knights, as lords or sirs, down to more humble gentlemen. Their incomes could range from £2,000 a year to £300 a year. This was the world portrayed in Jane Austen novels. The gentry were JPs, Justices of the Peace, they were members of Parliament, and distinction and forms of social distinction and their place in this hierarchy were so important for them that a whole series of new guides were produced. Guides like Debrett's and Burke's began to publish in the late 18th century and early 19th century to enumerate and classify the various forms of social distinction between them. Below this group were those who aspired to be gentlemen, who wished to become part of the gentry, and they took a number of forms. There were people in the business and in the professions. There were some 10,000 merchants, some 80,000 manufacturers, and some 20,000 professional types like medics and lawyers and clergymen and teachers. Their incomes could again range very broadly from something like £40 to £600 a year. Below them were the freeholders and farmers, many of whom were tenant farmers on the great aristocratic estates. There were some 350,000 of these people, and their incomes ranged from £40 to £150,000 a year. And then, alongside them, came the shopkeepers and the respectable tradesmen, about 180,000 in numbers, with incomes ranging from £40 to £400 a year. Some tradesmen and shopkeepers could be really of considerable wealth. And all of these figures are amalgamation from the figures of both King and Massey that you can see on your handout. Taken together, all of these groups, all of the aristocracy, the gentlemen, and all those aspiring to be gentlemen, amounted to something like a quarter of the total population. Below them lay the vast mass of the British population, and they came in two further groups. Artisans, whether they were masters or journeymen or apprentices across any hundreds and hundreds of trades. There were some 220,000 tradesmen of this type, earning probably around less than £25 a year. And then beneath them came the unskilled labouring poor. The majority of the British population, about 60% of the population, living on less than £10 a year. Now I want to make one final point about this social order. That central to the hierarchical nature of this system and to the entrenched power of those at the top of it lay three key institutions: the monarchy, the Anglican Church, and the universities, all of which had immense wealth. Indeed, there's very little work that has actually interrogated how wealthy the monarchy was. In 2009, just to give you a sense of the continuing wealth of the monarchy, the personal assets of the royal family were valued at £2.7 billion, consisting from cash and investments to £1 billion worth of artworks, to jewellery worth £130 million, to the land valued at £895 million, and so on and so forth. In addition, there was a crown estate, the income of which was only surrendered to Parliament in 1760 in exchange for the granting of a civil list by Parliament to help support the expenses of the monarchy. The Crown Estate was valued in 2010 at £7.3 billion, £4.5 billion of which came from its London property holdings, but there were also an additional 274,000 acres of land across the country. So, as you can see from the continuing wealth of the monarchy in the early 21st century, the wealth of the monarch was substantial in the 18th century. Similarly, the Anglican Church, the established Anglican Church, was really the next wealthiest institution. It held a million acres of land, 16,000 churches, 30 cathedrals, and 10,000 rectories and parsonages where its clergy lived. The total value of these holdings was estimated in the 1830s to be worth £35 million, and provided the church with an annual income of £7 million. In addition to this wealth, the Anglican Church occupied a powerful political place. Bishops were appointed by the Crown, and they sat in the House of Lords. And if this entrenched the political power of the church was also insinuated into the hierarchy of the social order, not just in the appointment of clergy to the sons of aristocrats and gentlemen, but in the very structures of the churches and their graveyards. So every church would have pews where the social hierarchy of the locality would be laid out in who got to sit where during the church service, just as the graveyard had special areas for the aristocratic families, other areas for those for tradesmen and merchants, and of course unmarked graves for most of the poor. Finally came the ancient universities. Remember that Oxford and Cambridge were the preserve of Anglicans only, although the Scottish universities were open to nonconformist Protestants. The wealth of these ancient universities is again considerable, and so considerable that to this day no one has really figured out how rich colleges in Oxford and Cambridge actually were in the 18th century. They had extensive land holdings across the country and growing and sizable endowments. To give you one example, St John's College in Oxford has an endowment valued in 2010 at £313 million. So, if that was the hierarchy of the social order and the key institutions that propped it up, let's now look at some of the ideas that began to challenge this type of social order. And here I'm going to be talking about this phenomenon called the Enlightenment, which is often linked to a story about secularization and the secularization of British society. But I'm going to be suggesting to you today that the Enlightenment didn't lead to any straightforward account of secularization, and that instead religion proved a very important midwife for civil society. That religion, as much as the Enlightenment, helped catalyze the emergence of new forms of public debate and social organization. But to do that, I have to first tell you about the state of the Anglican Church and the evangelical revival that sprang up within it. The Anglican Church, as we've seen, was made up very often of the sons of aristocrats and of gentlemen, and this meant that there were very often large numbers of absentee clergy, of clergy who were not resident in the parishes that they were responsible for administrating. Just to give you one example, in Devon, in the southwest of England, in 1780, up to 70% of parishes had absentee clergy who did not live there, and very rarely came down to preach there. Similarly, in Wales, very few members of the Anglican clergy actually spoke Welsh, which was the predominant language in many parishes. These factors meant that the state of the Anglican Church was not so robust for much of the 18th century. Indeed, as late as 1801, at the big festival of Easter, it's estimated that only 10% of the population actually took communion on Easter Day, one of the holiest days of the year, in fact, probably the holiest day of the year, next to Christmas. It was in an attempt to revive the Anglican Church that we have something called the Evangelical Revival. And this was pioneered by, firstly, a group of undergraduates at Oxford from the 1730s who tried to develop a more direct, informal, and heartfelt relationship with God, and mediating it through preaching, prayer, and music. They developed a new method of worship, and as a consequence came to be known as Methodists. Now, Methodism didn't break from the Anglican Church until 1791, and the greatest success of Methodism tended to be in those areas, like Cornwall and Wales and Scotland, and indeed in the North American colonies, and the new industrialising urban centres of the northwest around Manchester,